Hey everybody, I want to talk to you about counterarguments this week. So let's do this quickly, get into our Blackboard page and take a look at the assignment. As you'll see, Essay 1, Assignment 4 is a discussion board post, and there are a few elements that need to be included in this discussion board post. You'll see here in the assignment description that you need to have your opponent's argument. You also need to state your position as well as your refutation. Now, if you look at this handout from Purdue OWL, it talks a bit about rebuttal sections, and I'll actually go through counterarguments, what they are, what a rebuttal is, and why it's important. But I suggest that you pay attention to this section of the handout, which discusses what the opponent's argument is, what your position is, and what your refutation is. So that is the assignment. And I will actually call up my PowerPoint here. I should probably do a new share so you can see it. There we go. So this one is called Thesis and Counterargument. What is the relationship? So you need to think of your thesis and your counterargument as being intimate related. You have your thesis, which is argumentative, and it has the topic as well as your position or your stance within the argument. And the counter argument is your way of showing that you have considered the opposing viewpoint. So we need to think about this relationship between the thesis and the counter argument. They're somehow related. So thesis statements, to recap, is it's a roadmap, right? It provides a way of going through the essay or going through the argument. It also tells your audience why they should care. It answers that question, so what, right? If your thesis is not answering that question, so what, then you really need to start honing in and refining that thesis so that you make your audience want to read and want to see what you have to say about a certain topic, right? What your argument is. So the thesis has two parts in an argumentative essay. We have the topic, and as I said before, we have your assertion or your stance. So an example here is, to compete well in the global economy, the United States must make higher education affordable for any student who qualifies academically. So you see here with the color coding, the topic is higher education, affordable higher education, right? And the assertion or the stance is they must make it for any student who qualifies academically. So you can tell it's argumentative because of this key word here, must. If you look for words like must or should or ought, right? Those imply that somebody is taking a stand. Something needs to change, right? And I'm making an argument for something or against something. So look for those keywords. In an argumentative essay, the thesis statement contains your argument for the topic. So with counter arguments, they do a bunch of things, right? They identify or explain opposing viewpoints. They will summarize their stance. You will summarize their stance, the opposing stance, in your own words. It's also a way for you to concede and a way for you to respond. So, get my mouse working here, more on counter arguments. So you think of a few steps that you can go through for your counter arguments. Step one is to think about what your audience is thinking. And I want you to think of these three questions. Who might disagree with my position and why, right? You are thinking one way, so now you have to imagine what somebody who might disagree with you would say in response to your argument. Next question is, what reasons do people have for disagreeing with me? Is there a weakness in your argument? They have opposing viewpoints, right? What are the reasons for your audience to disagree with me? And then the third question is, what would support an opposing argument? What kind of source would support an opposing argument? What kind of reasoning, what kind of logic would be supportive of the opposition's viewpoint, the opposing argument or the counter argument. And then the second step is you'll make it sound like a valid thought, right? You'll say, okay, this is what the other side says about the argument. However, then you'll turn around and discredit. However, they're wrong because, and there you go, and that is your rebuttal. So there's a couple of steps there, and it's a lot to do if you're not used to argumentative writing and argumentative thinking. It can really be a lot to assimilate, especially the first time, which is why we do this. And I will help you through the process of learning how to deal with the counter argument. So how do you include it in your paper without making your own stance seem weaker, right? Because that's what students tend to think about. Well, if I present the opposing viewpoint, that's going to make my opinion seem weaker, which is actually not the case. So the counter argument is in an essay has two stages, right? You turn against your own argument and challenge it. And then you turn back to reaffirm your own stance, and that's what you do in your rebuttal, right? You're saying, this opposing viewpoint has some points, right? You'll say some nice things about it, and then you'll say, however, they're wrong because, and that is how you reaffirm your own position. So think of it as the turn against and the turn back. Another question is, where do I put a counter argument in the essay? And that really depends on how you want to organize your essay, what type of argumentative style you're going to use. Remember, I had a presentation on the various argumentative styles and where the counter arguments are included. So you can think of it in this way. A counter argument can appear anywhere in your essay, but there are some common places where they most commonly appear. It could be as a part of your introduction, before you propose your thesis, where the existence of a different view is the motive for your essay, the reason it needs writing. I don't suggest this for your first time through unless you're a really solid writer. It really takes a bit of crafting to incorporate the opposition in your introduction. And I think most of the times, at least for this first essay, students aren't really used to that. You know, they're still trying to get a decent introduction and then trying to deal with the counter argument, and it's hard to incorporate them both in the introductory paragraph. So I don't recommend that, but sometimes you will see that with more experienced writers. It could be included as a section or a paragraph just after your introduction. If you want to get it out of the way first and then provide all of your sources and all your support for your argument after that, that's fantastic, right? This is where you lay out the expected reaction or the standard position before turning away from it to develop and support your own stance. Conversely, it could be done as a quick move within a paragraph where you imagine a counter argument to one of your points, not particularly to your main idea, maybe to a sub idea. And in that paragraph, you just kind of give a nod to it. It's not a full paragraph about the opposing viewpoint, but it could be a quick move within a paragraph. That move, again, I'm not too keen on. But some writers can get away with it. And then lastly, as a section or paragraph just before your conclusion of your essay, in which you imagine what someone might object to what you have argued. So think of it kind of as you're winding down you're kind of making your way into your conclusion. So you have a section or a paragraph right before the conclusion that just kind of says, so some people think this, however, I still think that my stance is the right one. I wouldn't use that kind of wording, but you understand hopefully what I'm getting at. So yeah, you could use it before the conclusion, towards the end of the paragraph or end of the essay. So the two that I most commonly recommend for students is to have it either right after your introduction or right before your conclusion. So here we have some templates for entertaining objections. And these templates are actually taken from a really great text that I like to use in this course sometimes. And I will be linking this as a resource for you to read through on your own. It's not required reading, but it's a resource for you. So this is from chapter 6 of the text, They Say, I Say by Gerald Graff. And this is where you're planting what he calls a naysayer in your text, somebody who is against what you're saying. So these are just some templates. Templates are a way for you to kind of work into the counter argument. So one example here is, at this point, I would like to raise some objections that have been inspired by the skeptic in me. She feels that I have been ignoring the complexities of the situation. So here, you're just kind of playing devil's advocate with yourself. So here's another template. Yet some readers may challenge my view by insisting, and then you would insert the opposing viewpoint. Another one, of course, many will probably disagree on the grounds that, and then you would give some reasons of why somebody might disagree with you. So here's a textbook example, and this is actually from a writing textbook, The Composition of Everyday Life, a Guide to Writing. So they say here, some writers integrate a counterargument directly into their thesis statements. For example, let's examine this working thesis. College students benefit from living at home while attending school. So if we imagine the opposition, someone might argue that the college experience depends upon moving away from home, that intellectual growth requires leaving one's family and your familiar turf. This opposing position might be supported with personal testimony and stories and literature that tell of heroes leaving their homeland to seek knowledge or wisdom in the world. We would do well to consider these points and perhaps work against some or one of them directly. We might even work part of that logic into our own thesis. So the working thesis is then revised and incorporates the opposition here. Despite the attraction of living away from home and experiencing life in unfamiliar territory, see how this underlined section here is offering the opposing viewpoint. The person then continues in their thesis, college students benefit from living at home while attending school. So the thesis in this way now contains that counter argument. It's both an assertion and a response to an opposing viewpoint. So that is an option. If you think you can write strongly enough that you have a good argumentative thesis and yet also incorporate the opposition, that's fantastic. That shows me that you have some growth as a writer. So here we have some more templates for introducing objections informally. You could offer them as questions. Is my proposal realistic? What are the chances of it actually being adopted? Again, this is, kind of playing devil's advocate with yourself. A template, yet it is necessarily true that blank. Is it necessarily true that blank? Is it always the case, as I have been suggesting, that blank? However, does the evidence I've cited prove conclusively that blank? Right? So here you're kind of asking questions in your own head and in your writing that you will intend to give examples. Templates for making concessions while still standing your ground. So if you think back to the first week where we watched the video, and one of the questions was, what was the concession statement? So you have to think of the concession statement as being very similar, if not also the counter argument, right? This is where you're saying something, you may acknowledge some valid points in your opposition's viewpoint, but then you are going to immediately turn and say, however, you always want to reaffirm your own stance, reaffirm your own position. So that makes it that much stronger. So here are some templates Although I grant that the book is poorly organized, so it's admitting, yes, it's organized, I still maintain that it raises an important issue. And then I'm not going to read through all of these because you can read for yourselves. But these are handy templates. And again, I also will provide a copy of chapter 6 for you to take a look through the PDF and see if anything is useful for you there. Now, the third part of the assignment is, or the third part of your discussion post will be including a rebuttal. So during the rebuttal, you are turning back to reaffirm your argument. Remember, in an earlier slide, you're turning away from your own argument to pay attention to the opposition. And then in your rebuttal, you are returning to your original argument and reaffirming your position. You may consider the following rebuttal tactics and models for structuring them. So you could quote acknowledged experts that support your position. While many see this argument as flawed, comma, blank John Smith, an expert in his field, also finds. So this would be a way for you to integrate some of your quotations from your sources that you've researched that give support to your argument. Second one here is you could redefine the criteria of known concepts. Although I grant that blank, couldn't it also be possible that blank, there should be a question mark there, I think. And another one is find agreement and show how your new idea supports a shared idea. I agree with so-and-so that blank. Furthermore, this idea actually supports my point because blank. So here you're kind of conceding that there's a valid point to the opposition's viewpoint, and you can actually see how that also supports your own idea, right? In your own argument. That might be a little tricky to incorporate. And then there are templates for agreeing and disagreeing simultaneously. So I'll just read the example and then you can read through these on your own. Although I agree with X up to a point, so you're conceding, right? I agree somewhat. I cannot accept his overriding assumption that religion is no longer a major force today. So this is right, the point that you're going to pick apart, right? So that's another strategy you can use in your counter argument and rebuttals. So here is a nice handout from Cabrini University about counter argument and rebuttal, and they give this really excellent example here. And they say here, following the introduction of your rebuttal, you must then go on to suggest why the opposing argument is relatively less important or less likely than what you propose, and thus doesn't overturn your own argument. So here we have sections for the argument, the counter argument, and the rebuttal. And this is exactly what you're going to be doing in your discussion board post. You'll present your argument, which is your thesis. You'll present a counter argument, and then you'll have a rebuttal. So here the argument or the thesis is, the primary focus in medical end-of-life decisions should be on patient consent. Remember, we have that word there, that keyword should be on patient consent rather than doctor intention, because it is not a breach against the patient's rights if she or he consents to the termination of their life. The counter argument here, what would the opposing viewpoint be? Well, one could be terminally ill patients are likely to be depressed and therefore unable to consent to their hastened death in a balanced or acceptable way. And then the rebuttal here is turning back to reaffirm your own position. Depression can be managed. The relevance of depression may be made on a case-by-case basis. Depression does not warrant a general rule prohibiting patients from consenting to a hastened death. So here, you see this is actually an argument on oh my gosh, I just completely lost train of thought. So the following paragraph is one way in which you might introduce and rebut the counter argument from the previous slide. So this is how they put it all together. Yet some readers may challenge that basing medical end-of-life decisions on patient consent may lead to abuse. since many terminal ill patients are depressed and therefore unable to make sound decisions on matters of such significance. So you see here that the author is imagining a somewhat skeptical reader to introduce a counterargument and stating that reader's case. While it is true that such patients may have a greater tendency in depression, we cannot justifiably assume all patients are depressed, or that depression, even when present, prevents a patient from consenting in a balanced and acceptable way. So next here, we see the author is rebutting the counterargument by pointing out faulty analysis in the counterargument. So, and you also see that here, we have a little bit of a concession statement. While it's true that this, we can't say that, right? Pointing out the logical problem there. Depression is generally manageable nowadays, and a medical diagnosis can determine when a person is incapable of making such a decision. The issue of depression, therefore, should be dealt with on a case-by-case basis and not be a reason for prohibiting choice in general. So finally here, we see that the author is suggesting why this counterargument is less likely than what they propose, and thus it doesn't overturn their own argument. And there is my work cited. So hopefully this presents a little more clarity for you as to what a counterargument is, how to write one, where to include it, and to get this assignment done. Remember, the assignment is not due on Sunday. It will be due on Tuesday, the 15th, so that you can enjoy Super Bowl Sunday to the full extent. All right. Have a great time, everybody. Hooday. Bye-bye.